Welcome to the next in the series of webinars about accessibility. Today we're going to talk about the hidden accessibility pitfalls. So I've got an image here of the Titanic. And for those that may not know the story of the Titanic, it was a really big ship that sailed from Ireland across the Atlantic to America, or it was supposed to sail across. But the ship hit an iceberg and it sank. And the theme of today is, I suppose, along the lines of we can be really prepared for things, or we can think that we're really prepared for things, but we really need to make sure that when it comes to producing accessibility products, that we really know all that we need to know to make sure that that project gets to its destination. So yeah, the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank, and this is all about trying to avoid those icebergs and making sure that your project gets where it needs to go in terms of accessibility. So I'm Grant Broom. I've been working in accessibility for 20 plus years. That's a really long time. I founded Dig Inclusion in 2012 and I joined the Nile Group in 2023. And between Dig's experience of accessibility testing and Nile's strategic design, we've got a really nice combination of services, and we're a really good team to help you with your projects. We focus in at the moment a lot on accessibility and inclusivity. So we're also helping organizations to bring more inclusion into their teams to make sure that they're doing the right thing, and also making sure that their projects are much more inclusive. So we got quite a long list of clients. I won't go through them all, but we're working with public sector, we're working with private sector, retail, and other types of commercial services. We're also working with some charities. So if you're looking for accessibility services, to us, it doesn't matter what sector you're in. We don't really specialize in that way. All we need to know is that you're interested in accessibility, you're interested in providing products that work for everybody, and we'll be interested in working with you. There's going to be a Q&A at the end. So this session is probably going to take about half an hour, and then there's going to be a bit of Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions about anything that I'm talking about or anything in general, then use the QA button within the Zoom window and you'll be able to put your questions in there, and we'll get to them later. So to avoid the first pitfall, you have to understand that accessibility is difficult. So I've heard people say that accessibility isn't rocket science. And that is, while that might be true, that it's not rocket science, it is very, very difficult. You probably need help with it, because unless you've got a specialist team within your organization, or you've got a really good accessibility champion who understands all the aspects of building an accessible project, then there are going to be things that you don't know about. There are going to be these pitfalls in your project that you're going to struggle with. And you need someone to come in and point those out to you. So work with an external agency, or work with people within your organization that you know have good accessibility knowledge, and make sure that they're involved in the project from start to finish, because they're the ones that are going to ensure that when you get to the end of your project, that it's accessible. And that is super important these days. Accessibility is regulated in most countries. We've got new legislation coming out across the European Union next year that probably affects any organizations that are selling into the European Union, and it mandates that your products must be accessible to web content accessibility guidelines. So take this seriously. It's so important now. It's a legal requirement that you understand this. So make sure that you're doing all you can to understand it properly. And to illustrate the difficulty of accessibility, making products accessible, I wanted to point out the number of tests in 20 years that I've seen no failures on is 4. So these are clients that we've worked with. They've come to us for a first-time test. We've probably not worked with them before. They put the product to us, we've gone through it, we've sampled it, and we've tested it against the web content accessibility guidelines. and almost none of them pass accessibility the first time around. We then help them, we work with them, and we do a retest and things pass. But for a first time product, we don't see very many passes the first time around. And that just indicates to us that while people understand that accessibility is important because they've come to us for a test and they understand that there's certain aspects of accessibility that might be more difficult than others, a lot of organizations make the mistake of thinking that accessibility is simple and that it can just be done quite easily. And here's like a fake conversation that goes something like, client says the app needs to be accessible, and Barry says, yeah, no worries. And the product owner says, what's that mean? And Barry says, we just need to add alt tags for images. By the way, you don't say alt tags. You get shot by that by accessibility consultants. It's alt attributes or alt text. And the product owner says, that's a relief. It sounded complicated. And I think there is a danger of underestimating accessibility. Lots of agencies do it. We see it all the time. They don't understand the nuances of it. They don't understand maybe all the criteria. So adding good alternative text for images is a very important aspect of accessibility, but there are so many others. There are over 50 WCAG AA criteria that you need to meet, you need to understand, and you need to put them into your products to achieve an accessible product. And that takes some skill, it takes some knowledge, and it takes some experience. So the second pitfall is that it may take more time than you think, especially initially. So teams that are very good at accessibility that we work with some teams, well, I've probably worked with certain teams for the entirety of my career, and that's a long time. And they're very good at accessibility. They know what they're doing. They'll consistently make products that are accessible. And I haven't included those in that number of 4 because we work with them all the time, and we expect them to produce work that is just accessible out of the box. But they only get there because they know that they need to allow enough time to build accessibility into the projects. They know what they're doing. They make sure that their teams are trained. Accessibility is part of the conversation. They've got an inclusive culture, and they just build accessible products. It's just part of their DNA. For the rest of us mere mortals, it may take a bit more time than you think. There's going to be some upskilling, but a very important aspect of this is where testing fits into the product life cycle. So we can see, if we just focus in on the test and remediate part of the product life cycle, this can be something like 4 weeks. So we'll get a test from a client, we'll test the product, we'll find some accessibility issues that'll go back to the client, to the engineers. They'll remediate, and then we come back to testing, and then that process starts again. Now that whole cycle can take about 4 weeks. So we're talking about a month of test and development time added to the project every time we do a test or remediation. Might be 4 weeks, might be longer, might be shorter, but that's in the ballpark. Can you really afford to have your project delayed by a month? Because because it still has accessibility issues and you can't release without it, or arguably worse, you release with the accessibility issues and you say, oh, we'll come back and fix those later, which you might not. So make sure that you build accessibility into your product lifecycle, start testing early, continue to test throughout that product development. And hopefully by the time you get to release, there's very little to do. Test little and often, and that is how you get to an accessible product at the end. And always build accessibility into that life cycle right throughout it, right from the discovery stage, right from wireframes. Make sure that you're talking about accessibility and put the time in to make sure that that's done properly. The third pitfall that I want you to avoid is by knowing your web content accessibility guidelines. So I mentioned earlier that there are 50 web content accessibility guidelines, 50 plus in AA conformance, and that is where you need to be to make sure that your product is accessible. But there are some common knowledge gaps. So we see them all the time where a product's got reasonable accessibility, but right throughout the product, there's this particular issue that that affects the accessibility of it, and it means that it's not going to pass through the guidelines. So let me give you an example. This one is orientation, and this is a level A criteria. So if you're in government in the UK or the EU, then you need to meet this criteria. Very soon, if you're a commercial organization in the EU, you're going to need to meet this particular criteria as well. So what this is the goal of this criteria is devices can be used in any orientation. And we're mainly talking about mobile phones here because we don't tend to turn their laptops on their sides. But we might turn something like an iPad on its side. And the idea is that when we switch the phone like this, the layout changes. And when we look at web pages, that's more or less what happens, is that as long as you've got a setup on our phone, we can change the orientation of the device and we'll get a display that is fitted to that particular orientation. And this is important because some people with mobility issues may have a mount. They may have a device mounted on their desk, or they might have a device mounted on their wheelchair and it's in a particular orientation. So here we've got a screenshot of one such device that's mounted to a wheelchair. It's got a phone holder on it, and that phone is held in place in this particular picture in a portrait orientation. But for lots of people with mobility issues, it's not possible for them to reach out and change the orientation of that device. So it's really important that whichever orientation their device is, they're able to view this, your application, and without having to reach out and change the orientation of their device, that it just works in the orientation that they already have it set. Now, as I said, this works very well with websites most of the time. The problem that we get is when we come to web applications. So what I want you to do now, a little bit of audience participation, is I want you to grab your mobile phone if you can, and I want you to open an app. And if you're an organization that has an app, then I would urge you to go and have a look at that. And I want you to view it. So here's an example of an app that I have on my phone. I've got lots of apps like everybody does, but this is one that I wanted to display. But I would say that the problem that we're going to see is just typical of any app, that when we change the orientation of our phones, when we flip it into landscape mode, nothing happens, that it remains exactly the same. And you can see the difficulty here for someone who is maybe has their device set up in landscape mode, or they had to change the orientation of the device for some reason or ask for help with that, and then they go to the next application and that doesn't open in landscape mode. And this is an extremely common issue for mobile applications, is that they won't work in both orientations. But this is a requirement of WCAG, and you all need to be thinking about this, and you need to be talking to your design teams about, okay, this is it's difficult. I'm not saying that this is a simple thing to achieve. It requires a lot of extra design. It requires good understanding from your teams to make sure that this information reflows properly. So it's quite a big ask, but as I said, this is a requirement now, and you need to be making sure that you build this feature into your products. And there's lots of features like this that you don't know about. So everybody knows that you have to have good alternative text for images. Most people know that you have to have good contrast for your content. But this is one of the ones that people tend not to think about. Another one would be audio description. So audio description is where you have a video on your website. You might have thought about having a transcript. You might have thought about having captions on it, which are requirements for AA. Captions are anyway. But have you thought about audio description? Audio description is where you've got an additional track over the audio track of your video, which explains important things that are happening in the video. So if you can think of something like a manufacturing video, there might just be lots of noise, maybe some music or something like that. But you need a voice over that, explaining the detail of what's going on within that particular process. So someone who can't see the video is able to get that information. That's another thing that we see that is frequently missing from video content is audio description. So there's quite a few gotchas with the guidelines that people just aren't aware of, and it's really important, as I said in the previous slide, that you know your WCAG, that you know that there are certain aspects of accessibility that aren't talked about very much. They might not have been experienced, or you don't come across them very often. Certainly not in this case. If you build in an app, this applies to every app. It needs to work in landscape mode as well. So there's just one for you. But know your WCAG. Make sure that you know all of the aspects of creating WCAG compliant products. So the next pitfall to avoid is to check your contract. When did you last check your supplier paperwork? So by that, I mean the contract that you could give to a supplier, which sets out what it is that's expected of them when they're building a product for you. So many contracts don't have the things that I think should be in them to make sure that people are producing an accessible product. So things might be things like suppliers must produce WCAG 2.2 compliant software content. So having that line in there gives the contractor or the supplier an indication of what you mean by accessibility. So I've seen contracts that say that a product must be accessible, or we expect the product to be accessible, and that's it. There's no definition of accessibility, and it's too fluffy. It's too fluffy. When you're talking about having accessibility in your contract, you absolutely have to have WCAG 2.2 AA. I should probably have added AA into that slide, because that is a reasonable standard of accessibility that people could be expected to achieve, and that's what's required by law, where the law states WCAG. It's AA compliance. I won't go into what that is. Maybe that's slides for another day. But that needs to be in there as a statement, so organizations, everybody knows what they're talking about. You can hold people to account for that. You can get a tester in, like maybe Dig Inclusion. We can go in and we can tell whether that product meets AA conformance or not, and we can tell you that, and then you can go back to your supplier and have this fixed. I'd also have a line in there that's saying non-compliant content must be remediated within X time of issues found. So there must be a reasonable amount of time for contractors to be able to fix this, and you need to take that into account with your project timeline. So if you're releasing by a certain date, or if you've got some post-release work that needs to be done, you have to put an expectation on your contractor to know they have to fix it within a reasonable time. Otherwise, your risk is still there while they're trying to figure out this issue and how to fix it. And you can imagine something like an orientation fix would take a very long time to fix, which is why you should make sure that you build it in the first place. But if what you don't want to be as a client is just waiting a very long time for that thing to get fixed. Okay, so you definitely need a line in there giving them a timeline for that. And on that note, make sure there's a warranty period for accessibility issues as well. So we very often see clients of ours paying for accessibility issues. Actually, this is the next point, but there is no warranty on those products in terms of accessibility. So the cost and the onus is on our clients to make sure that is fixed within a reasonable time. So on that note, remediation and testing is at the supplier's cost. So we can often go through with a client numerous test and remediation cycles, trying to get a product up to scratch for AA conformance. And what we find is that the burden is often on our client and not the supplier. So the burden of the remediation testing, the time it takes to allow that remediation to happen and test again, that is often costed. The burden of that cost is often on our client, and it shouldn't be that way. Okay, that definitely should be on the supplier. They have a contract that says it needs to be AA conformant. If it's not conformant, then that supplier needs to burden the cost of testing and the remediation as well, and get it all fixed within a good time. Now, you'll be surprised how many organizations and the size of organizations that don't have any of these things as part of their supplier contract. And you could, I suppose, argue that the product needs to be fit for purpose, but in actual fact, you don't want to go down that road. That's like kind of a legal route. Nobody goes that way. They just want products out the door that are accessible. So I would urge you, as soon as you can, just go back to your contracts that you have for your suppliers. It's probably some sort of pro forma that's filled out. Maybe someone hasn't looked at it for a while. Make sure that it's up to date with the latest WCAG standards, that there is a warranty period, and that issues are fixed within a certain amount of time, and that the testing the cost of testing is on the supplier and not on the client. Okay, those are really important things to have there. Think about how you would treat this if it was security testing or anything like that. Treat accessibility in exactly the same way. So that brings us on to maintenance. How do you keep your products accessible? How do you make sure that you've invested in making sure that your product is accessible on its first release? That product's probably going to be around for a while. You'll expand it, you'll add features to it, you'll change it, you might rebrand it. How do you keep products accessible over time? Essentially, you've got to put the effort in to not let things slip. And I've done a talk on this already. Make accessibility and inclusion part of your culture. By doing that, and we work with teams that do this, they ensure that whenever they're talking about the development of a product or moving on to the next stage of a project, then the accessibility inclusion part is talked about. They'll talk about a feature. They'll say, okay, how do we add this new sign-on feature? You know, is it tested for accessibility? Is the color contrast right? Have we thought about the design? Have we thought about the orientation of this particular feature? All those things just get discussed. It's not just down to a designer or developer to put it in, and you're relying on their knowledge. This is a group effort to make sure that everything is checked, it's regulated, so that anything that we add or take away from the product is accessible. Test products with every new release. So this is where I would say is that you're not just testing a feature, you're not just testing a component of the project, but you're every time you release it, you go through a full audit again. And there's good reason for that. It's because we often see products slip back a little bit in terms of accessibility, or we might get issues that weren't there before that have been reintroduced accidentally by rolling back a feature or something like that, or somebody replacing some new code with some old code. And sometimes engineers put things in without saying, you know, they're not on the release notes or anything like that. So every time you've got a new major release, make sure that you go through a full accessibility test again. So test all of your sample pages again for AA conformance. Go with the external testing team, go with an internal testing team. As long as you know your stuff and you can do that properly, just do that in any way you can, but make sure that you put the time in to do a full retest of that product to make sure that it's got all the features that it needs to have. Small tests are cost effective, little and often. So instead of leaving all your accessibility testing to the end of the project, like we see time and time again, People come to maybe 2 weeks before release and they just want a stamp of approval for accessibility. It's happened to us this week. We can't, we can't just do it like that. There is a cycle. There is the test period. There is the whole remediation phase, and then testing again, before you're happy to release that product. Don't do it like that when you're maintaining a product. Make sure that you're testing little and often all the way through. You can have a service level agreement contract with an accessibility company just to come in maybe a couple of days, a month, or once a week or something like that, just to help you make sure that your product is on track. Do things that way. Do things little and often, and then when it comes to the end of the project, you're in much better shape to get a sign off so you can get your release on time. Train new team members. So one of the reasons why things slip, and why we see a lot of regression in projects sometimes, is that new suppliers or new team members have come into the project and they're not familiar with accessibility. They don't know the importance of it. They don't know that it's important to you as an organization, and they will produce things that aren't as accessible as they should be. And you couldn't expect things to be any different, because if people haven't been shown how important this is, or how critical it is that they understand why things need to be accessible, and if they haven't been taught how to make things accessible, then you're going to have some gaps in your product, and that is going to start failing on accessibility. You don't want that. So make sure that when you get new people into your organization, including new suppliers, make sure that they've had adequate training so that they know what WCAG is all about, what accessibility and inclusion is all about, and how important it is to you as an organization. Okay, so I've got a little bit of time for some bonus content here, and I just wanted to quickly run through the most common accessibility issues. So these are the issues that we find have the highest frequency in testing. So we've got data now for through our accessibility platform, Hugger. So Hugger is a platform that we built at Dig Inclusion to help us with accessibility testing, to record results, and to give us data about general accessibility issues, and also to generate reports that we can share with clients online. And we've extracted some of the information from that to just find out what are the most common accessibility issues. And the first one on our list is name role value. So this is where we've got a component on a screen. Let's say it's a radio button on a form, and it doesn't have a name. So for example, you may have yes, no buttons, radio buttons on a form. It's not labeled, so it's missing a name. Sometimes it doesn't have a role. So a screen reader user, someone who's blind and listening to the web page through text-to-speech software, they don't know what the role is. All they'll hear is something like clickable, and that's all they'll get from that. They don't know what it's called, they don't know what the role is, and they don't know whether it's checked or unchecked. This is a very, very common issue. So whenever you've got a component within your interface, make sure that it's got a name. So in this case, it would be yes, the role would be radio button, and checked or unchecked. All of this is built into HTML. So if you build in standards compliant HTML code, then this should already be in there. If you built in more rich interfaces, then you can use ARIA, roles, and techniques to build this in. The next issue that's very common is missing or wrong alt text. Very often we've got images, and it is, considering that this is the accessibility issue that most people know about, it's surprising to see how often we still get missing alternative text for images, or the wrong alt text for images. So images that aren't described properly. They may have some text in there, but it doesn't describe it properly. Another issue that we may have is, or that we see commonly, is color contrast for text. So the text doesn't meet the minimum color contrast requirements for WCAG. And then contrast for borders. So this is a new guideline. We've had color contrast for text for quite a long time, but color contrast for borders is where we might see a form control, and the outside edge of that form control has a color, has a line that doesn't meet minimum contrast issues. Missing or illogical headings. So sometimes headings are styled within pages, just making them bolder and larger, but they're not marked up for screen reader users and other assistive technologies. And here's a big one. So this is a very critical issue, is keyboard accessibility. Lots of applications haven't been tested with just the keyboard. So a lot of testing involves, excuse me a second. It's better. A lot of testing is done just with clicking with the mouse. People don't go through that application and just use the keyboard, which is the tab key, the enter key, the arrow keys, to make sure that they can move out an application, get them to different links and form controls. And this is still one of the most common issues that we see, that you can't control that interface through a keyboard alone. Dynamic changes, so thinking of pop-ups, modal dialogues, where you'll click a button, a pop-up will come up and you need to interact with that. Very often we see that when people are using a keyboard, they're still interacting with the background page and the focus hasn't been put in that pop-up. List markup is often missing. So you might get lists in menus and things like that, but it doesn't have a list markup. And that means that people using screen readers don't know how many items are in that list. They don't know when they've moved from one list item to the other. It can sound like a big paragraph. So make sure that if you've got anything that looks like a list, have list markup. Form labels are in at number 9. I'm glad to see this so far down the list, because if you don't have forms labeled properly, that when a user enters something like an input field and it doesn't tell them what that input field is for, then they can get really stuck like that. And the last one is focus order. So this is where you'll be navigating an interface visually. You might be using a keyboard, but when you tab from one item to the next, the focus order disappears, or if you interact with something, the focus order disappears to the top of the page. All of these are very common issues. There are lots more beside these, but these are the most common ones according to our data. Okay, I think that's nearly it. The next webinar is the truth about AI and accessibility. So that will be a really interesting one for me as well. I've still got some research to do on that. That'll be Tuesday, 12th of November at midday. And I hope that we'll see you there. And Taras, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we've had a couple in. So Lucy asks, let me just bring it up. When and how often should we aim to test our work for accessibility to ensure compliance is ongoing? Presumably it's not a one and done thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely not a one and done. Before testing, you have to make sure that accessibility is just part of the conversation. You need to know that you're talking about it, and that you're talking about it intelligently, and that people know what they mean by accessibility and what they mean by meeting those criterion. I would always recommend working with a specialist. That can be either in-house or an external agency, and you should be testing every sprint, I guess. Assuming you're in an agile process, every sprint you should be testing for accessibility to some extent. In terms of different stages of the project, you want to be testing at the wireframe stage. So as soon as you got some designs to look at, you should be probably sending those out to an agency to ask them if there are any accessibility issues that can be spotted just from the wireframe. So this is before we've got an interactive product. So definitely at that stage. And then as soon as we've got some components to test, we'd like to be testing those as well, because that'll give us a flavor of how good you are at accessibility and whether some more training is required. It'll also help you to not keep duplicating accessibility issues throughout the product. So if you can take a look at some components early on, we can spot some accessibility issues, tell you about it, and then you'll be able to make sure that every component going forwards is accessible. And then I suppose as often as you can throughout the project, every time you've got a new type of component. So you may have done your forms, you may be embedding video, you may introduce something quirky like some sliding controls. So every time that you've got some new content, then that should be tested. A lot of agencies these days have content libraries, so component libraries so components that have already been tested for accessibility, and that's the best thing that you can do to make sure that the core of your project is accessible, and then we have a much easier time testing when we come to testing the whole product before release.
Cool. And just one more from Rachel, who asks, how can you foster a culture where accessibility really is everyone's job? Are there any strategies that you've seen that worked well in making that kind of shift?
Yeah, so we do see it. We do see that we do see work with organizations that have really good accessibility cultures and some and we can compare those to organizations that don't. How do you foster it? I think probably the best way is to have accessibility champions in the organization. So someone that you've identified as they're keen on accessibility, they're passionate about it. I got into accessibility because I was an accessibility champion for a small web agency in Swansea, and at the start of my digital career. And I think that's the best way, because as long as you've got someone who doesn't mind talking, someone who is keen to learn, someone who is very good at sharing information and communicating. What I found in that organization is that we very quickly built up an appetite for making sure that accessibility was in everything that we did, and also we got really good at it very quickly. So I think maybe just making sure that you give some agency to individuals within the organization that know about accessibility and that care about it. I would say that is the best way to get started. And then after that, make sure that you have regular slots to discuss accessibility and inclusion within your organization. Because I think you build it by talking about it. If you're not talking about it, you're not going to be able to make the right types of moves to get in towards that culture. So 100% make sure that you got people who are experienced in it in your organization. Also, make sure that you're employing people with disabilities. It's hard to ignore people with disabilities when they're sitting at the desk next to you or they're on the Zoom calls that you're talking about. So make sure that is part of your onboarding or your what's the word? Not procurement, when you're trying to find
Recruitment.
people. Recruitment, thanks. Yeah, make sure it's part of your recruitment. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Cool, thank you. Got a couple more questions. Angelo asks, can you speak to the legal consequences of not practicing accessibility?
A little bit, yeah. So legally, you're under the Equalities Act 2010. I'm just talking about the UK here. Other countries have their own legal frameworks, but under the Equalities Act 2010, not providing accessible content could be seen as discriminating against someone. So there is the potential for someone to come after you for damages. It could be an individual or it could be class action, which means that you'll get an organization taking you to court because on the behalf of all people with a specific disability, all types of disabilities, and they could be awarded very large sums. You could be in the news, you could have bad press, and we have seen bad press, for organizations that haven't provided good accessibility. Just look up Domino's Pizza. They really did a bad job of accessibility and inclusivity, and they're a name that at least us in the industry just associate with poor accessibility and bad inclusion practices. So there are legal frameworks everywhere to make sure that people do produce accessible products. The penalties of that, we don't see a lot in the UK, but if you look, and I think that's largely because of culture. But if you look across the pond to the US and have a look at what's happening there in terms of awards or class action lawsuits against organizations, there are hundreds hundreds. And I think that once we start seeing cases here in the UK, and once it's, common knowledge that, organizations can be sued for not producing accessible content, then I think that could open the floodgate. So yeah, it's at the moment here in the UK, we're avoiding that type of situation. But yeah, it could be triggered very quickly, I think.
Cool. And finally, Danielle asks, will we be sent a link to the AI and accessibility webinar? It sounds super interesting.
Yes, yes. I think you'll have already registered for this event. So I think we'll be sending out automatically links for the next event to us. Is that how we do things?
Yeah, we'll be in touch with a link to the next event and the recording of this session as well, if you want to review it or share it with any of your colleagues or friends.
Yeah, fantastic. Good. If you want to get in touch, then you can get in touch with me through LinkedIn. So there's not many grant rooms there, so it should be fairly easy to find. You can also come to the Dig Inclusion website or the Nile Company website. We've got hello@diginclusion.com, and there's a phone number you can contact there as well. But reach out in whichever way you'd like, and we would absolutely love to hear from you and talk to you about accessibility. Thank you very much.